Welcome to Occult Archives, where we uncovered the mysteries, myths, and legends behind history's most feared books. From mystical grimoires to ancient religious texts, these books carry secrets too dangerous to be read. Are you ready to turn the pages of the unknown? This is Season 1, Episode 18, The Gospel of Thomas, The Hidden Teachings of Jesus. Let's dive in.
Ooh, I love a good hidden teachings episode.
For this deep dive, you shared some really fascinating excerpts claiming to be from the Gospel of Thomas and some related apocryphal acts. What was it about these sources that made you think, this is something we need to explore?
Well, they're like these little windows into early beliefs about Jesus and his followers. Beliefs that kind of sprung up outside of the official biblical canon. It's a chance to hear those echoes from a time when people were grappling with who Jesus was and what his message meant in all these different ways.
Right, like getting a peek behind the curtain.
Exactly. A wider lens on the whole religious landscape of the time,
Yeah.
instead of just that one official narrative.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The text we're looking at starts off with this really powerful call to action. It urges people to, turn away from evil, embrace good, acknowledge one God as the ultimate ruler, and it suggests that acting according to God's will is the key to future blessings. What do you think this direct address tells us about who this writing was for? What was its purpose?
It's so direct, right?
Yeah.
It feels almost urgent, like a personal appeal.
Yeah.
It's clearly trying to persuade whoever's reading or hearing it to follow a specific moral path. And it dangles this promise of reward if they do, like, hey, get on the right side and good things will happen.
Yeah, it definitely lays down the law
Yeah.
right from the get-go. It's like, okay, this is right, this is wrong.
Totally. And then it gets even more specific because right after that call to action, we get a list of these core moral commandments. Respect your parents, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet. It even mentions that the original text had a placeholder for the divine name, like they wanted to keep it open to interpretation.
Interesting. And these principles feel pretty universal, don't they? Like we see echoes of these ideas in so many different cultures and belief systems.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a huge overlap with the Ten Commandments, which obviously play a central role in Judaism and Christianity. So these basic rules about how we should treat each other seem to have been a pretty consistent thread in the moral fabric of the time.
Okay. But here's where things start to get really interesting because now the text dives into these stories about Jesus's early life, stories that we don't find in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Like one of the first ones involves a fire that mysteriously can't burn the infant Jesus's clothes, and then these clothes become like treasured relics. Why do you think stories like this popped up? What made them important?
It instantly sets Jesus apart, right? From the very beginning. It's
Yeah.
like saying he's not just an ordinary baby. He's special. He's protected by a divine force. I mean, fire is such a powerful destructive force, and it can't even touch him. That image just screams divinity.
It's a pretty strong visual, isn't it? And then we get the story of Herod's reaction to the Magi and the flight to Egypt, which is something we do find in Matthew's gospel. But this text adds its own spin to it. It talks about idols breaking and other gods literally falling down in the presence of baby Jesus. What kind of statement do you think that's making?
Oh, it's a bold statement for sure. It's like saying, look, even as a tiny baby Jesus is already a threat to these other beliefs and deities. His presence alone disrupts the established order. It's a declaration of his supremacy right from the start.
Yeah, no messing around. And the miracles keep coming. There's this fascinating little detail about thieves being scared away by sounds like a king's procession, which allows Joseph and Mary to help some captives. It's not like Jesus is actively doing anything, but his presence seems to bring about this unexpected salvation.
Right. It's like this ripple effect of goodness.
Yeah.
It suggests that even without consciously trying, Jesus is already a force for good in the world. Even as a baby, he's disrupting evil and bringing about liberation. It's a subtle but powerful message.
And then we get into a whole bunch of healing stories associated with the infant Jesus. There's a woman who's tormented at night and finds relief just by being near him. And then there's this really detailed story of a woman with leprosy being cleansed by his bathwater, which then becomes a source of healing for other people. What does this emphasis on his physical presence and things associated with him carrying this healing power tell us?
Well, it points to a belief that Jesus was inherently holy, right?
Yeah.
That even ordinary things that touched him became imbued with this divine power, like his bathwater. It's not just about him actively performing a miracle. It's like his very being radiates this healing energy.
Yeah.
And that energy can be transferred to others. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
Yeah, it's like this almost magical aura surrounding him. And it's not just physical healing either. The text mentions sorrow turning into joy at a wedding through Jesus' intervention,
Yeah.
although we don't get the specifics on that one. But it hints at his ability to impact emotional states as well as physical ones. We also see him healing children with eye diseases using that bath water again. So we're seeing this recurring theme of healing through physical connection.
It's like building this foundation for his later ministry by showing all these miraculous events happening even in his childhood. It's like saying, this isn't something he learned or developed. It's who he is. It's in his nature from the very beginning.
Right? And then things get even more interesting because now we come to some stories that are pretty unique to this tradition. Like there's one where Jesus, at age certain, creates these little clay animals that come to life and obey him, which is quite a step beyond just healing someone, isn't it?
Oh, totally. It takes the idea of his extraordinary nature to a whole new level.
Right.
Now, he's not just healing, he's creating life. Not just any life, but creatures that obey his every command.
Yeah.
It's like saying he has this inherent authority over the natural world, and it's all there from a ridiculously young age.
Yeah. And the wonders just keep coming. We
Hmm.
hear about him changing the color of cloths in a tub, extending or shortening wood for Joseph's carpentry work just by touching it, and even commanding a snake to suck back poison from a boy it had bitten. These stories almost feel like he's demonstrating control over the very fabric of reality.
I know, right? It's like he's bending the rules of the physical world to his will, and it all feels so effortless for him. It really reinforces that image of him as this divine being who operates on a completely different level than us mere mortals.
There's also this little story about Jesus demonstrating advanced learning beyond his teachers. He even refuses to say bet without understanding Aleph, which are the first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet. It's a small detail, but it speaks to this wisdom and insight that seems way beyond his years.
It's like saying true knowledge comes from deep understanding, not just memorization. Or maybe it's a subtle dig at the traditional education system of the time. Like, hey, even a kid can see through the limitations of rote learning.
Could be. Then we hear about him identifying thieves of oxen on Mount Tabor, calming a storm at sea, judging fishermen's disputes in Tiberias. And all of this seems to happen before his public ministry as we know it traditionally begins. So his influence is extending beyond just these miraculous feats.
Right. He's not just this otherworldly figure performing these grand gestures. He's also involved in the everyday lives of people settling disputes, offering guidance, demonstrating justice. It paints a picture of someone whose presence and influence are felt in all aspects of life.
And then there's the story about the lion speaking of God's greatness and obeying Jesus' command to go to the desert. I mean, come on, a talking lion. That's quite an image.
I know, it's such a powerful symbol. It reinforces this idea that Jesus' dominion extends over all of creation. Even the animal kingdom recognizes his divine nature and submits to his will. It's like this ultimate affirmation of his power.
And finally, we have the account of Jesus multiplying harvested ears of grain in a flooded field, which is obviously a clear echo of the later feeding miracles. But here it's happening when he's still a child. What do you think is the significance of placing this kind of miracle so early in his life?
I think it's about establishing that this power to provide and sustain is an inherent part of who he is. It's not something he develops later on. It's always been there. Like, even as a kid, he has the ability to feed the hungry and meet people's needs. It sets the stage for his later ministry, but it also roots those abilities deeply in his very being.
Okay, so now we get to the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. And there's this interesting little detail here. Jesus actually instructs John to purify him, even though John hesitates, recognizing Jesus' superior status. But Jesus insists, saying that it's about fulfilling the law. Why do you think that emphasis on fulfilling the law is important in this context?
It's like a nod to the existing religious traditions, even though these texts often portray Jesus as being above or beyond those traditions. It's saying he's not here to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. It's a way of connecting him to the existing religious framework while also signaling that something new is about to happen.
And then, of course, we have the descent of the Holy Spirit as a dove, and the voice of the Father declaring Jesus as his Son beloved and the creator of heaven and earth. That echoes the canonical accounts, but with that added declaration about Jesus' role in creation. What do you think that addition tells us about how Jesus was viewed in this tradition?
Oh, it takes things to a whole other level. It's not just saying he's the Son of God. It's saying he was there at the very beginning. He
Correct.
played an active role in the creation of the universe.
Yeah.
It's a huge statement about his divine identity and his integral connection to God from the very start.
It's like saying he's not just a prophet or a teacher. He's something far greater.
Right, and it has a profound impact on those who witness it. The text mentions that the disciples' faith was strengthened by this event. Which makes sense. I mean, if you saw something like that, you'd probably be a believer too.
So this baptism scene is kind of like a public unveiling, isn't it?
Exactly. It's a confirmation of his divine nature and his mission. It sets the stage for everything that's to come.
Okay, so now we shift gears and start looking at some of the miracles and encounters Jesus has in Jerusalem and beyond. And one of the first ones we encounter is the healing of a deaf-blind man who then recognizes Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of Man. And there are even specific references to prophecies from Isaiah and Daniel. Why do you think these texts go out of their way to link Jesus's actions to those Old Testament prophecies?
I think it's all about validation. It's saying, look, these miracles aren't just random acts of power. They're the fulfillment of what was foretold in the scriptures. It's a way of connecting Jesus to this long line of prophetic tradition and saying, see, this is who he is. This is the one the prophets were talking about.
Right, it's like building a case for his messiahship. And then we get another talking animal. This time it's sheep speaking to Jesus in human language, acknowledging him. We had the talking lion earlier. What do you make of this recurring theme of the animal world recognizing and responding to Jesus?
I think it speaks to this idea of universal recognition, that Jesus' divine status isn't just something that humans acknowledge. All of creation is aware of it.
Mhm.
Animals, plants, even inanimate objects, they all seem to sense his power and react to it in their own way.
It's like saying his influence extends beyond the human realm. It permeates all of reality.
Right, exactly. And then we have the raising of a dead man named Bagelsman who immediately proclaims Jesus as the Messiah. Raising the dead is a pretty big deal in terms of demonstrating divine power, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It's like the ultimate miracle. It's a direct challenge to death itself.
Mhm.
And in Jewish tradition, it's a key sign of the Messiah. So it's a really powerful statement about who Jesus is and what he's capable of.
And it's not just a demonstration of power. It's also a validation of his identity. It's like saying, okay, even death can't stand against him. He is who he says he is.
Then we see an encounter with temple priests who question Jesus' authority. And Jesus' response is basically that his authority comes from his Father in heaven, which is a direct challenge to their skepticism. This kind of conflict with religious authorities is a recurring theme in stories about Jesus. What does this particular exchange highlight for you?
I think it highlights the tension between Jesus' message and the established religious order of the time. He's not playing by their rules. He's claiming a direct connection to God that bypasses their authority and their interpretations. And that's going to ruffle some feathers for sure.
It's like saying, I don't need your approval. My authority comes from a higher source.
Exactly. And then we get a story about Jesus helping an indebted old man named Zika by causing his dried olive trees to yield fruit, which feels like a more personal, less overtly miraculous kind of miracle. It's not about parting seas or raising the dead. It's about addressing a very real and practical need.
Right. It shows his compassion and his willingness to get involved in the everyday struggles of ordinary people. It's a reminder that his power isn't just about these grand displays. It's also about bringing relief and hope to those who are suffering.
And sometimes that relief comes in very practical ways, like a bountiful harvest of olives.
Okay, so now we come to a really dramatic event. Jesus promises to raise Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel from their tombs as a sign. And he actually does it, accompanied by an earthquake and a shining appearance of these women, who then testify to Jesus' power and his role throughout history. I mean, that's quite a claim, isn't it?
It's a huge claim. And it's so significant because these aren't just random people. These are the matriarchs of Israel's history figures who are deeply revered. Bringing them back from the dead is a powerful statement about Jesus' authority and his connection to the very foundations of their faith.
It's like saying, look, even the most revered figures from your past recognize and acknowledge me.
And their testimony isn't just about his power in the present. It also connects him to the past and the future. They talk about his role throughout history, from creation to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and beyond. It's like saying he's not just a man of his time. He's an eternal being who has always been and always will be.
Wow, that's pretty heavy stuff. And then we have Jesus' prophecy about destroying and rebuilding the temple in 3 days, which is misinterpreted by some as foolish. This is something we see in the canonical Gospels too, but it's interesting that it pops up here as well. Why do you think this saying continues to be a source of misunderstanding and contention?
I think it's because it operates on multiple levels.
Yeah.
On the surface, it sounds like he's talking about the physical temple.
Yeah.
But he's actually talking about something much deeper. He's talking about his own body and the new covenant he's going to bring. It's about the destruction of the old order and the establishment of something new and spiritual.
So it's a clash between literal and symbolic interpretations.
Exactly. And then we have this interesting detail about Jesus seeing a vision of Ezekiel's wheel with 4 faces in the temple, which is a very specific and quite mystical image from the Old Testament prophetic tradition. What do you think the inclusion of this detail suggests?
Well, to me, it suggests that Jesus is being positioned within that lineage of Old Testament prophecy. He's not just some random guy claiming to be the Messiah. He's someone who's deeply connected to the spiritual and prophetic history of his people. He's someone who understands and embodies the divine mysteries.
And Ezekiel's vision is all about God's presence and power and glory. So it's like saying Jesus is intimately connected to those very same things. He's not just a prophet, he's the embodiment of God's presence in the world.
Okay, so now things get really intense because the text describes Jesus bringing forth Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses from their tombs, and they testify to him in the temple. It's another powerful demonstration of his authority over death and his connection to Israel's patriarchs. But the Jewish authorities refuse to believe it and accuse them all of sorcery. They even link them to Jains and Jambres, who are these figures from Egyptian tradition associated with magic and deception. What do you think this reaction tells us about the level of opposition Jesus was facing?
It's like even when confronted with undeniable proof, they still refuse to accept it. Their minds are made up. They've already decided that Jesus is a fraud, and nothing's going to change their minds. And by accusing them of sorcery, they're basically trying to discredit them and undermine their authority. It's a desperate attempt to hold on to their own power and control.
Yeah. It's like saying we'll do whatever it takes to maintain the status quo. And then things escalate even further because the Jews try to stone Jesus again. And this time a cloud appears and takes him to the Jordan River, and the resurrected patriarchs return to their resting places. What's the significance of that miraculous removal, do you think?
I think it's a powerful image of divine protection. It's like saying you can't touch him, he's not subject to your violence or your hatred, he's under God's protection, and you can't harm him.
It's like a cosmic game of keep away.
Right. And then to top it all off, the four living creatures from Ezekiel's vision appear in flesh where Jesus was and worship him before returning to their place in the temple. It's like this grand finale that ties together all these themes of divine presence, prophetic imagery, and Jesus' unique status.
Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at how these texts describe the calling of the disciples and the early stages of Jesus' ministry. And one of the first things we encounter is the familiar story of Jesus calling Peter and Andrew by the Sea of Tiberias. They immediately leave their nets and follow him, and Peter's name is changed to Cephas. What do you think that immediate response tells us about the impact Jesus had on these early followers?
It speaks of the power of his presence and his message. He must have been incredibly charismatic and compelling because they drop everything to follow him. It's like they recognize something extraordinary in him, something that draws them in and makes them willing to leave their old lives behind.
It's a total leap of faith, isn't it? And then we had a really interesting detail that we don't often see in traditional accounts. The text mentions that Mary, Jesus' mother, was also performing cures, but she chose not to have them written down out of humility. And even says that the apostles learned from her. What does this suggest about Mary's role and influence in this tradition?
It gives her a much more active role in the early ministry. It's not just saying she was the mother of Jesus. It's saying she was also a healer and a teacher, someone who played an important part in spreading his message. And her humility in not wanting to draw attention to her own miracles just adds another layer to her character.
Huh.
It's like saying she's not in it for the fame or the glory. She's genuinely committed to the mission.
And then we hear about Peter sanctifying an altar and Jesus teaching after his resurrection. So even though he's no longer physically present, his influence continues and the foundations of the early church are being laid.
Exactly. It's like saying his work doesn't end with his death. His teachings live on through his disciples and the community they're building. And those early rituals, like sanctifying an altar, are starting to take shape, laying the groundwork for the future development of Christian worship.
Then we get this detail about disciples baptizing people, including children, in a pagan encampment, which suggests that the Christian message is already spreading beyond the Jewish community and that infant baptism was practiced in at least some circles. What do you think the inclusion of these details tells us about the scope and nature of the early Christian movement as it's portrayed here?
Well, it suggests that the movement was very outward focused right from the start. They weren't content to just keep the message to themselves. They were actively seeking to spread it to new people and new cultures. And the fact that they were baptizing children suggests that they saw this as something that could be passed down through generations. It was about building a lasting community.
And it's not just about spreading the message, it's also about putting those teachings into action. Because we hear about Jesus providing for the poor through his disciples. So there's this emphasis on social justice and caring for the most vulnerable members of society.
Right, it's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And that commitment to social justice is something we see throughout the Gospels as well. It's a central part of Jesus' message.
And then there's a discourse against the Pharisees regarding practices like fasting, washing Sabbath observance, and associating with publicans. Jesus is portrayed as emphasizing the love of God and neighbor as the core commandments, which again echoes many of the conflicts we see in the canonical Gospels. What's the significance of this recurring tension between Jesus' teachings and Pharisaic traditions?
I think it's about challenging the status quo. Jesus is coming in and saying, look, it's not about blindly following rules and rituals. It's about what's in your heart. It's about loving God and loving your neighbor. Those are the things that really matter. And that message is going to be disruptive to those who are invested in maintaining the old ways.
It's like saying you can't just go through the motions. You have to actually live out your faith in a meaningful way.
Exactly. And that's going to make some people uncomfortable,
Yeah.
especially those who are in positions of power.
Okay, so now we're going to delve into the acts of the various apostles after Jesus' ascension. And each of these accounts offers these little snapshots of their individual ministries and the challenges they faced. Let's start with Cephas, or Peter and Thaddeus. They confront a rich youth who wants to perform miracles, but they tell him that he needs to renounce his wealth. And when the youth attacks, Thaddeus Peter performs a rather dramatic miracle. He makes a man and his camel pass through the eye of a needle multiple times. What do you make of that particular miracle?
Well, it's a pretty striking image, isn't it? And it's obviously a very literal interpretation of Jesus' teaching about the difficulty of the wealthy entering the kingdom of God. It's like saying, look, if you're attached to your possessions, you're going to have a really hard time getting through that narrow gate. It's a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't about material possessions.
Yeah, it's about something much deeper. And then we have the story of the healing of King Aguirre of Edessa through a letter from Jesus. And then Thaddeus is sent to baptize him after the crucifixion and resurrection. And Thaddeus recounts the events of Jesus' passion and resurrection to the king. So this account is significant because it shows the spread of Christianity beyond Judea, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the earliest examples of the Christian message reaching a non-Jewish audience.
Hmm.
And it's interesting that it happens through both written communication and personal contact. You have the letter from Jesus, and then you have Thaddeus coming in person to baptize the king. It's like this two-pronged approach to evangelism.
And we also get a brief mention of Helena of Adiabene converting to Jewish customs, although we don't get a lot of detail here. Even that little snippet is interesting, though, because it shows the fluidity of religious boundaries at the time.
Yeah, it's a reminder that people weren't always neatly categorized into one religion or another. There was a lot of crossover and interaction between different belief systems. People were searching, exploring, trying to find their own path.
And sometimes those paths converged in unexpected ways. Okay, so now we come to the Acts of Peter and Philip. And their story involves preaching an encounter with a cloud of fire that recedes when people believe in Jesus founding a church and a miraculous construction. What's the significance of these kinds of dramatic, supernatural events that accompany the apostles' ministry?
I think they're about confirming the apostles' authority and the truth of their message. It's like God is saying, look, I'm with them, I support them. I'm backing up their words with these incredible signs and wonders. And that would have been really persuasive to people who witnessed those events.
It's like the ultimate seal of approval. And then we move on to the Acts of Philip. And his story is full of these amazing details. We have a talking leopard who repents for harming a lamb after hearing about the apostles. Philip raises a widow's son. He confronts a man named Ananias who's swallowed by the earth. He preaches in various regions. He encounters Mary Magdalene, and they face persecution together. What does all of this tell us about Philip's ministry?
It tells us that it was incredibly diverse and far-reaching. He travels all over the place, performing miracles, confronting evil, spreading the message. And it's not just about the spectacular stuff either. There's that really touching story about the leopard repenting, which speaks to the transformative power of the Christian message on a very personal level.
It's like saying even animals can be touched by God's grace.
And then we have the Acts of Andrew and Bartholomew, which are full of these fantastical elements. They travel in a spiritual ship. They heal a judge's wife. They confront a monstrous creature that becomes meek after encountering an angel. They open locked gates miraculously. And they raise a dead boy after initially leaving because of the crowd's reaction. It's like a greatest hits of miracles.
I know, it's amazing. And then we get into the Acts of Andrew and Paul. And their story focuses on Paul's vision of Gehenna and his encounters with Judas's spirit, which gives us some insight into early Christian beliefs about the afterlife and the consequences of betrayal. Why do you think those kinds of details were important to include?
I think it's about reminding people that there are consequences to their actions. that choosing to follow Jesus has eternal implications, and that rejecting him could lead to a very different outcome. It's a way of reinforcing the seriousness of the Christian message and the importance of making the right choice.
It's like a glimpse into the spiritual stakes involved. And then we have the Acts of Matthew, or Matthew. And his story involves preaching in a town with a temple of Apollon, a miraculous light causing the idol to fall and break numerous conversions, persecution, attempted burning, an earthquake, and even a staff that becomes a tree. It's a pretty dramatic account of the clash between Christianity and paganism, isn't it?
It is. It's like a microcosm of the larger conflict that was playing out. At the time, Christianity was seen as a threat to the established order, and those who embraced it often faced intense opposition.
Yeah.
But the miraculous events that accompany Matthew's ministry demonstrate that he's not alone. He has divine power on his side.
It's like saying, don't underestimate the power of this new faith. It has the ability to shake the very foundations of your world.
And then we have the story of James, the son of Zebedee, who was one of Jesus' closest disciples. And he's known for his prominence among the apostles and his martyrdom under Herod Agrippa, which is something we also find in the book of Acts. But this text adds some extra details. It talks about a soldier guarding James, converting and being beheaded alongside him. And there's a tradition of James's body being miraculously transported to Spain. What do all of these details add to our understanding of James's significance? They show us that he was a powerful and influential figure both in life and in death. His martyrdom is a testament to his unwavering faith and his willingness to die for what he believed in. And the conversion of the soldier shows the impact he had on those around him even in his final moments. The story about his body being transported to Spain is a later addition, but it speaks to the reverence and devotion he inspired in generations to come.
And then we come to the Acts of John, which are full of these really dramatic and sometimes even severe displays of power. He encounters a wicked servant, performs numerous healings, raises the dead, causes some people to die, and then revives them upon repentance, heals various afflictions, escapes imprisonment, continues to preach, and even has a vision of Jesus. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, and I think what stands out to me is the intensity of his ministry. He's not afraid to confront evil head-on, and he has this incredible authority over life and death. The episode where he causes people to die and then brings them back to life is particularly striking.
Yeah.
It's a powerful reminder of the consequences of sin, but also the boundless mercy of God.
It's like saying, I have the power to destroy you, but I also have the power to save you. The choice is yours.
And finally, we come to the Acts of Judas Thomas, also known as Didymus. And his story is all about his missionary journey to India, where he performs miracles, converts people, and establishes the Christian faith. It's a fascinating account of the spread of Christianity to the East, and it's full of these amazing details. He sells himself into servitude, he witnesses a heavenly maiden song, he heals people at a wedding, he confronts royalty, he raises the dead, he breaks idols, he appoints bishops, he encounters a talking snake, he defeats the snake, and he teaches about inner transformation in the kingdom of God. Whoa. It's a whirlwind of a story.
I know, it's like a spiritual adventure epic. And what strikes me is the diversity of his experiences. He encounters all sorts of challenges and obstacles, but he never wavers in his faith. And his teachings about inner transformation really echo the core message of Jesus. It's not just about outward actions. It's about changing your heart and your mind. It's about becoming a new creation.
Right. And his journey to India is so significant because it shows that the Christian message wasn't limited to one particular region or culture. It had the power to cross boundaries and reach people from all walks of life.
Okay, so now we're going to take a look at some excerpts from the Gospel of Thomas, which is a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. And these sayings are often more enigmatic and sometimes even contradictory to the sayings we find in the canonical Gospels. We encounter ideas like the kingdom being within and outside the need to enter, like newborns, the reversal of the first and the last, the importance of the inner light, and sayings about not being able to serve two masters, the need to hate your family, and the world being like a carcass. What do you make of these sayings?
They're so different from the teachings we're used to hearing, aren't they? They're more mystical, more paradoxical. It's like they're inviting us to look deeper, to go beyond the surface level of understanding. And there's this definite emphasis on inner transformation, on finding the kingdom within ourselves. It's a very different flavor of Christianity than what we typically encounter.
Yeah, it's almost like a secret wisdom that's being revealed. And then we have a brief apocalyptic section which outlines these predicted events for the end times involving cosmic disturbances, fire, angelic warfare, and the deliverance of the elect. This kind of apocalyptic imagery was pretty common in early Jewish and Christian writings, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was a way of expressing their hopes and fears about the future.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of saying, look, this world is messed up, but there's a better one coming.
Yeah.
And in that better world, God will triumph over evil, and those who remain faithful will be rewarded.
It's a message of hope in the face of adversity. And finally, we get some additional details about John the Baptist, including his parentage, his escape to the desert as a child to avoid Herod's slaughter, his ascetic lifestyle encounters with luminous shapes, and his testimony about Jesus at the baptism. What do you think all of these details add to our understanding of John?
I think they paint a richer, more complex picture of him than what we get in the canonical Gospels. He's not just this wild-eyed prophet yelling in the wilderness. He's a man with a deep spiritual history, someone who has been set apart from birth for a special purpose. And his encounters with these luminous shapes suggest that he's been touched by the divine in a very real way.
It's like he's been preparing his whole life for this moment to announce the coming of the Messiah.
And his testimony about Jesus at the baptism is so powerful. It's like he's passing the torch saying, okay, my work is done. Now it's his turn.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored these alternative accounts of Jesus's life and ministry, the Acts of the Apostles, and even some apocalyptic prophecies and teachings about the afterlife. What are some of the key takeaways that stand out to you?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that early Christianity was far more diverse than we often realize. There wasn't just one single monolithic belief system. There were all sorts of different interpretations and traditions circulating, and these texts give us a glimpse into that richness and variety.
It's like saying there wasn't just one way to be a Christian in those early centuries. There were many paths.
And another takeaway is that these alternative accounts often emphasize the miraculous and the supernatural in ways that we don't always see in the canonical Gospels. It's like they're pushing the boundaries of what's possible and exploring the limits of human and divine power.
It's a very different way of looking at the world, isn't it? Where miracles are not just possible, but commonplace.
And I think it's also important to note that these texts were clearly meaningful to the communities that preserved them. They weren't just random stories. They were cherished narratives that shaped people's understanding of Jesus, his message, and their own place in the world.
So they offer us valuable insights into the beliefs and practices of those early Christians.
Absolutely. And they challenge us to expand our own understanding of what Christianity was and what it could be.
So for you, the listener, we leave you with this. If these stories and sayings hold echoes of early beliefs, what other hidden or lesser-known traditions might have shaped the religious landscape we know today? What other voices from the early church might still have stories to tell us?
It's a fascinating question to ponder, isn't it? There's so much that's been lost to history, but there are also so many treasures waiting to be rediscovered.
And who knows what secrets those treasures might hold.